Do you know what happens when the cold arrives before death? It sounds crazy, but that's exactly what I encountered in one of the strangest cases of my career. I'm Oscar Molina, a forensic doctor in Valparaiso, Chile, and this is my weirdest case. A body that seemed to defy all the laws of physics and medicine. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. I'll tell you quickly. The body arrived at a morgue with an unusually low ambient temperature, something that, although uncommon, could be explained. The problem was that when measuring the temperature of the corpse, it didn't fit the time frame the records indicated. Instead of following the classic pattern of body cooling, the body was colder than expected. But not all over, nor gradually. It was a pinpoint coldness, localized, almost as if it had lived against the clock. It wasn't a typical case, neither suicide, nor common homicide, nor accident. Nothing at the scene gave clear clues. I reviewed environmental reports, the conditions at the place of death, chemical analyses of tissues, and even the nearby security cameras. Everything was in order, everything seemed normal, but the body didn't obey those rules. What caught my attention most was a biological anomaly in the skin, a microscopic sign that, in short, told me something nobody else expected. This person had been dead a few hours less than we initially thought. Not days, hours. And that cold, exact precision ended up changing the way I would assess time of death from then on. So stay with me because I'm going to tell you how that strange cold arrived first, and how a detail that might seem small ended up dismantling all forensic logic. This is not just any case. It's a mystery that broke my way of understanding death and time. When the body arrived, the environment was not like any other day in Valparaiso. In the morgue, the ambient temperature was lower than normal, and that already put me on alert. But the body, that was another story. When I took the rectal temperature, I felt something didn't fit. The cooling didn't match either the time of death or the time in the morgue. It was strange, odd, as if death had gone fast, but the cold had come first. Under normal circumstances, a corpse loses heat at a relatively constant rate. There are tables, formulas, and even apps to calculate the exact time of death based on that. But here, nothing worked. I even compared to other bodies that arrived the same day with similar estimated times, and there was no comparison. I started reviewing the whole scene. The weather conditions, which in Valparaiso tend to be stable at that time of year, showed something strange. A sudden drop in ambient temperature a couple of hours before the discovery, a cold front that hadn't been officially reported but had affected nearby mountainous areas. Could that explain the accelerated cooling? Not entirely, because the internal temperature of the body showed areas much colder than the environment. Chemical tests didn't give a clear answer either. There were no signs of toxic substances or external agents that could explain such an abrupt physical change, and the tissues had remained well preserved with no signs of freezing. But it was in a microscopic study where I found the key. A minimal alteration in the skin cells, usually used to measure decomposition, showed an atypical process. That alteration indicated the body had been dead only a few hours, but the body temperature pointed to a much longer time. That's when I realized the cold had arrived first. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was a biological phenomenon. This information showed me that the patterns we use to estimate time of death can fail when the environment acts in unforeseen ways. It also made me understand that the body doesn't always follow fixed rules, but can react differently depending on factors beyond traditional knowledge. What seemed like a contradiction became a lesson in humility. Death isn't always cold in the literal sense, but in this case, temperature was the hidden message that changed everything. From that moment on, whenever a body arrives in strange conditions, I don't rely only on temperature or classic tables. Now I look for those small biological clues, those tiny details that tell hidden stories we don't always want to see. This case in Valparaiso taught me that even in death, precision is key, and that time isn't measured the same for all bodies. And you, what would you do if the cold came before death? Do you think science will always be able to explain what happens when the body is silent and only the cold speaks? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next video. The ambient temperature, lower than usual, had already awakened my curiosity from the very first moment I was informed about the arrival of the body. That was not something easy to ignore under conditions I knew well, especially in a port city like Valparaiso, where the weather could be unpredictable, but never so cold without an apparent reason at that time of year. However, when I began to examine the body, what really puzzled me was the way that cold manifested in the corpse, because it did not follow the classic pattern that all forensic experts memorized from the first days of practice. The body temperature had not decreased linearly nor toward equilibrium with the environment. It was as if something or someone had altered that natural process. In my years of experience, I had seen cases where, due to extreme environmental conditions or particular diseases, the body changed its cooling pattern, but this was different, much subtler, and at the same time, much more disturbing. From that moment on, what I had before me ceased to be merely another corpse. It became a mystery that completely captivated me. I began to search local temperature records. I consulted meteorological reports, nearby stations, satellite data. Nothing indicated that the extreme temperature drop was a general phenomenon. Furthermore, the environmental sensors installed in the hospital and surrounding areas showed no strange spikes or cold storms to justify the event. I also inspected the room where the body was found, looking for any kind of machinery, abnormal refrigeration, or even chemical substances, but everything seemed in order. That was when I decided to return the body, this time with more tools. I took tissue samples, chemical analyses, tried to measure internal temperature by various methods, rectal probes, ear thermometers, even infrared thermometers to verify the skin and deeper areas like the liver or heart. The indicators did not lie. The body's temperature was indeed very low, but the speed and manner in which it had dropped was impossible under the environmental and temporal conditions indicated by witnesses. To begin understanding what was happening, I decided to analyze the vital signs during the last part of this individual's life. Although clearly already dead, the metabolic patterns, or rather, their traces in organism, offer me clues. I found a curious alteration in the rhythm of cellular decomposition, as if the body had been in a different vulnerable state, something akin to an early biological hibernation, but not typical nor known in humans. When I shared this with some colleagues, they looked at me with surprise and a hint of skepticism. No one in official science had reported this phenomenon before, and as always, forensic science is a field that accepts evidence but also rigorous skepticism. Unwilling to give up, I started searching in other areas. I explored the body's chemistry, toxicology analyses, residues of unusual substances, compounds that could slow down common biochemistry. No drugs, no aggressive chemicals or hallucinogens. No signs of poisoning either. The victim appeared to have been healthy, or at least free of infections or intoxications, at least until right before death. I began thinking of natural causes. Could the person have been in an extremely cold environment before dying? But there were no records or testimonies confirming exposure to prolonged or extreme low temperatures. Moreover, general signs of freezing did not appear on the body. There were no visible damages from severe cold, no crystallizations, no specific rigor matching prolonged exposure to external cold. This led me to another point. I decided to review the surveillance cameras near where the body was found. The area was a place of low night traffic, and the scene showed no signs of violence or struggle, ruling out a fight or use of known external agents. However, an old, noisy, low-resolution camera showed something strange. A man dressed entirely in black who stopped in front of the victim for a moment before leaving, but the strangest thing was the shadow he cast, much longer than normal, as if something else was dragging behind him. I did not want to disregard that evidence, but I was not ready to accept interpretations outside scientific logic. The investigation slowly became an obsession. Every hour spent away from the body made me doubt more and more. There was something intangible, imperceptible, a kind of story hidden between the bodies and the cold, and I had to discover it. Then I remembered that the only variation I found during the thermal study did not come from the temperature itself, but from a minimal biological alteration, a molecular marker indicating that the death process was not as old as it seemed at first. In fact, the precision of that alteration suggested the person had died just a few hours before being found, despite the body already being noticeably cold. This information planted in me the seed of the inexplicable. How could a body cold for hours be in such a recent biological state? I began to plan to proceed with the autopsy in greater detail, looking for any symptom that would justify an internal thermal anomaly, a peculiar chemical reaction, or any detail at the cellular level that might help me understand a hidden story within those icy tissues. While performing the autopsy, a strange sensation overcame me. It was not fear nor frustration, but a mixture of fascination and respect. This body had something beyond material death. Its organs seemed almost frozen in a kind of temporal pause. The heart, although stopped, showed a pattern of micro-lesions and contradictions that did not correspond to any common pathology. Its brain, which normally deteriorates quickly after death, retained marked molecular activity in the neuronal areas, as if it had sustained a kind of residual consciousness, barely extinguished. There, in that mixture between cold and life, I knew I was facing an extraordinary event. I continued meticulously, examining every detail of the circulatory system, searching for any sign of external or internal intervention, an unknown substance that could have trapped that person's life in a suspended instant. But I found no evidence that the body had been chemically or technologically manipulated, at least not with known advanced technologies. The more I looked for answers, the more it seemed that the cold that arrived first was directly related to the death, but in reverse. It was not death that cooled the body, but an unknown cold, external or even internal, that might have accelerated or caused a death. But what could that cold be? A natural phenomenon or something beyond human logic? The day passed, and my forensic colleagues began losing interest, ignoring what I felt was an essential window towards something new. For them, it was an atypical case, but not special. For me, it was an invitation to rethink the rules of death, time, and cold, factors I had until then believed immutable. With every piece of data, the pressure increased, and my mind, though tired, stayed clear, obsessed with a single objective: to understand what story lay behind the cold that came first. After a few hours, I received a forensic genetics report that hit me suddenly. The body's biological markers were altered in their molecular degradation rhythm, precisely in those processes known as the postmortem circadian clock, which usually serves to determine with high precision how much time has passed since death. But in this case, the results did not fit with the time indicated in all reports. It was almost as if the body had experienced a biological temporal regression or a partial stoppage that froze its metabolic process right after death. That could not be explained by conventional science. At that moment, all rationality in me clashed with the evidence itself. I began mentally reviewing all the data and searching for patterns that escaped human logic. I thought, again and again, about the body's reaction to sudden cold, a phenomenon that, for some unknown reason, preceded death or happened exactly in parallel, without witnesses noticing. As I floated in that spiral of uncertainty, I remembered an old conversation with a colleague about the boundary between life and death and how certain extreme conditions can modify that threshold. It was a discussion that seemed abstract until that day, but the living proof, or rather dead proof, in front of me forced me to reconsider fundamental concepts. And there, in that moment suspended between certainty and doubt, I realized I was about to discover something that would not only change my work, but also my way of understanding the human being in their final stage. I could not imagine then that early, unusual cold was only the first sign of an even deeper revelation. The story of the body challenging me had to go beyond numbers, reports, and measurements. It was a clue to a phenomenon that until then had remained invisible to forensic experts in science, something that could reshape the very boundary between life and death, and perhaps open a path to a new understanding of time and human beings. And that night, as I closed the autopsy, I felt a chill on my skin that did not come from the morgue or the low temperatures. It was the cold of the mystery just beginning, and I knew my professional life would never be the same. Hours passed, and I remained engrossed in every detail, as if the body came to life in my mind to the tiny clues that the cold and time granted me. I realized I couldn't limit myself to the usual methods. I needed to go further, to combine science and observation until everything fit together or at least hinted at a direction. That's why I decided to contact experts in applied physics and molecular biology, fields outside pure forensic science, since I felt the solution wasn't only about what is seen at first glance or routine examinations. One night, after an exhausting day, I received a call from one of those specialists. In their voice, there was cautious enthusiasm, the same mix of uncertainty and amazement that I felt. They spoke to me about a little documented phenomenon where certain molecules contained in some organisms can enter an almost suspended phase under very particular cold conditions, slowing down cellular fate processes to levels that defy the passage of time. They explained that recent studies in extremely cold environments, like Antarctica or experimental cryopreservation labs, showed how life could, in theory, slow its molecular clock without dying immediately. They suggested that perhaps, unknowingly, I was facing a human case that had gone through something similar. That idea struck me because for years I had accepted that death is a sharp instant, a point of no return marked by clear signs we study with mathematical precision. But if there was such a fragile threshold between death and the biological pause induced by cold, that could explain everything without it being science fiction. However, it was also a territory full of unanswered questions. How did that cold originate? Who or what caused it? Was it natural or artificial? Because, after all, the body was where it was supposed to be, with no clear signs of physical manipulation, and the place showed no unusual alterations. I returned to Moore with this new perspective and decided the next step was to repeat and expand the molecular analyses, but with greater precision and covering details I had never addressed before. During the extended autopsy, while observing the heart almost intact in its microstructure, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed weeks earlier, a series of tiny crystalline structures, not visible to the naked eye but detectable under an electron microscope. They did not match ice nor common blood crystals or salts. They were irregular shapes, fragments that seemed to resonate with the interaction of biological compounds, and some type of element foreign to human biology. This finding led me to investigate whether there had been any unusual environmental exposure minutes before or after death. I got in touch with experts in atmospheric chemistry and radiation, searching for clues in the area's environment. A few days later, I received an email with another unexpected turn. They were detecting in the surrounding atmosphere a type of ultra-cold particle, unlike any common particles we know, potentially linked to unusual electromagnetic storms that had occurred that very night, according to recent satellite measurements. The heart of the case beats faster, yet subtly, silently. This new information was not only practical, but almost seemed like an impersonal wink from the universe. If there was an external environmental phenomenon strange enough to affect the body's temperature and the post-mortem molecular structure, that could explain the baffling biological pause. At this point, science and mystery walked together, and although most people rejected the idea for not being able to verify it directly yet, I felt I was at the frontier of something gigantic. But the following hours brought a discovery that unsettled everything once again. A more detailed analysis of the nervous tissues revealed elevated levels of a protein that appears only under certain extreme cellular stress conditions and have been studied experimentally for freezing living neurons during high-risk surgeries. It is a compound known for protecting cells from cold or hypoxia-induced damage, suggesting that the body, or specifically the brain, had developed a mechanism that delayed its own death, a kind of molecular self-protection. Could cold then not only be external, but an internal cellular defense mechanism? This hypothesis made me review all protocols and consider how the exact moment of death could be altered, or at least the temporal perception of it, by effects beyond the usual. I stayed awake more than one night, imagining how that mechanism could be applied to prolong life, or leave traces that would confuse even the best scientists. The paradox was that the body, although technically dead, seemed to resist that final state with kind of retained molecular vigor, a silent struggle against the last cold. It was amid these reflections that I decided to request a third report, this time with specialists in biophysics and experimental nanotechnology. The reaction was disconcerting. Between the lines, I detected that the case resembled a phenomenon which until now had been theoretical, associated only with very advanced cryogenics experiments seeking to pause vital processes without damaging tissues. But how did that pause get there in an ordinary person in Valparaiso that early morning? My questions piled up along with growing uncertainty. I couldn't tell if I was facing a still unknown natural phenomenon, or if someone, no matter who or why, had intervened with secret, experimental, or even prohibited technology. The long shadow I saw in that secret chamber seemed to make more and more sense, like a tangible sign that not everything can be seen at first glance, and that reality hides deep layers only a handful of people will be willing to explore. With each new piece of data, I sank further into the spiral of bewilderment, but also felt a certainty. I had touched that invisible edge where death is not an absolute enemy, but a permeable process vulnerable to unknown forces. I understood that forensic science, so precise and methodical, had to open itself to perspectives that seemed implausible until facts proved otherwise. My task was no longer just to determine how or when that person died, but to understand what forces took part in that story. One early morning, while reviewing security videos, something hit me again. The figure dressed in black hadn't just stopped for a moment. It seemed they had exchanged something, a kind of energy, an invisible presence. Using image enhancement and advanced thermal analysis techniques, I was able to perceive that, for a brief second, the temperature didn't drop but rose, as if the unknown person carried a source of heat or life that counteracted the extremely low ambient temperature. That contradiction made me think about those who have the power, real or symbolic, to play with natural laws. Finally, I understood that the cold that arrived first was at the same time a message. It wasn't just cold. It was stop time, a pause in existence that could contain in its essence both threat and hope. And although nothing in my experience had prepared me for this, I knew this case had opened a door to a terrain where neither death is definitive nor cold simply cold. Closing the final report, with a shadow of cold in my mind and the certainty that death was merely another boundary, I realized I had found a key to question not only science, but the very nature of time and life. The body had become a frozen enigma, an open book teaching me that the impossible only waits to be discovered. And as I left the morgue, with the city still wrapped in that night breeze, I had to ask myself, what if cold doesn't come after but before? How deeply are we willing to penetrate the mystery when death seems only a cold you never expected? I plunged back into the records of that night, reviewing again and again every image, every thermal datum, searching for a pattern that would help me understand that fleeting exchange between the body and the figure dressed in black. It was as if, during that ephemeral instant, the line between life and death, between heat and cold, had fractured, and in that invisible gap something occurred that defies all logic. I couldn't grasp what shape that something had, whether it was energy, information, or simply an environmental condition we hadn't imagined until then. But the sensation was clear. There was a force that not only slowed down the inexorable process we all know well, but in a certain way seemed to defy it, as if cold and time were engaged in a silent, invisible battle before our eyes. Days and tests passed, and although my experience as a forensic doctor had always been based on rigorous certainties, in this case it seemed I was treading a blurry terrain, where science meets the improbable. It was an anomaly, yes, but also a call not to close ourselves off to the unknown. Something told me that behind it all there was a story no one told, a secret hidden beneath layers as dense as the cold that wrapped that body. I tried to talk with colleagues, share what I found little by little, but many looked at me skeptically, almost as if I were making it up. The forensic world is used to simple certainties. Death has to be read in clear signs. In this case, defied that nature because it didn't submit to common rules. That's why I began to look beyond the body, toward the people who had been near the victim, toward the place where everything had happened, and toward the story that body seemed to tell without saying a single word. Questions arose that had previously seemed irrelevant. What had that person done hours before dying? Who had they been with? How likely was it that they had unknowingly been exposed to a rare environmental condition? When reviewing police reports, I discovered that a few hours before the discovery, there had been a strange disturbance in the neighborhood's electrical grid. Neighbors reported brief, sudden power outages, something common in some areas, but that night it coincided with a strange atmospheric phenomenon scientists were studying. The idea that there could have been electromagnetic interference affecting not only devices, but life itself was unsettling, yet every element in this story seemed to point toward that invisible thread. One day, while analyzing the thermal images again, I noticed a detail I had overlooked before, a faint, flickering light that appeared at certain intervals from a corner near where the body was found. That light was neither natural nor from any known source. It seemed rather like a pulse, an intermittent signal traversing the atmosphere with a rhythm that did not match natural patterns. I consulted with an applied physics specialist who had contacted me weeks before, and he told me that this type of signal could be associated with low-temperature energy experiments, which, although secret, left perceptible traces for certain sensitive equipment. This new coincidence opened a universe of possibilities and dangers, for there were machines or devices capable of creating such extreme and controlled conditions, then something much greater than a simple natural phenomenon might be at play. Slowly, I realized the phenomenon had not only altered the body to the point of slowing its biological functions, but had also left a mark on everything around it. The ultra-cold particles detected in the atmosphere did not seem accidental. They seemed part of an experiment, a trial to understand and master that strange threshold between life and death. I was surprised to find that in international research databases there was, although rarely and with great caution, mention of protocols to induce states close to cryostasis in patients for complex surgeries, but always under controlled conditions and with rigorous medical supervision. Here, however, it seemed the process had occurred unexpectedly and in isolation, leaving the body in that kind of cold, suspended limbo, an inexplicable peace on the border of existence. Then came a dawn when the morgue seemed more like a sanctuary for a mystery than a mere storage place for lifeless bodies. While reviewing the latest molecular analyses, an intercepted email from a group of secret researchers who had access revealed something that left me breathless. They spoke of a shadow project experimenting with biochemical agents and nanostructures capable of inducing states of selective molecular freezing, that is, not just ordinary cold, but cold directed at manipulating life at the cellular level and, more disturbingly, at the neurological level. The document mentioned that certain tests had produced results similar to what I had detected, but had been shut down due to high risk and lack of regulation. Everything fit, and yet didn't fit, because no one had been officially informed, not even the local authorities. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Could that body have been an innocent victim of these covert experiments? Or perhaps an unwitting guinea pig? The issue grew even darker when a police record revealed that the man dressed in black seen in the recordings had disappeared without a trace shortly after the discovery, as if he had evaporated into the cold dawn that enveloped everything. With every piece of data, the plot tangled and deepened. It was as if the cold that arrived first was not just an isolated event, but the first sign of something much greater, a silent war against time and against death, a battle using technology and science barely understood. The more information I received, the more aware I became that I was trapped in a story that might forever change our perspective on the limits of life and death, and that perhaps that corpse was, in reality, a messenger from a future where those boundaries would be even more blurred. There came a moment when I decided I had to share what I had learned with the world, but I couldn't do it openly. What I was investigating was too sensitive, too uncertain to be accepted without resistance. So I chose an intermediate path, to prepare a detailed report for certain open-minded colleagues, experts who would continue this quest from different approaches, but always with utmost discretion. I knew this was only the beginning, and that later I would find answers, but also new questions. On that path, I understood something crucial. Death as we know it, with its inexorable coldness, might not be definitive. There might exist that space between life and death, a space dominated by cold and suspended time, where the body homologated to death still holds murmurs of existence. A limbo perhaps created by science, perhaps by nature, or who knows, by the hidden will of someone defying the rules of the game. This understanding changed me, made me see death differently, not as an end but as an unknown territory, a threshold full of unsettling possibilities. The city of Valparaiso went on with its indifferent rhythm, its tide of people unaware of those invisible silences I had traced. But for me, the night would never be the same again. That frozen body and that cold that arrived first were an eternal reminder that our world has secrets not written in any book or celestial body, but that beat or freeze, right at the edge of science and mystery. As I finally closed the last file, with the imaginary snow of that nearly palpable cold in my mind, I asked myself once again, if the cold could stop death's clock, what other forces might be playing with the invisible threads of life? Because in my experience, the border between yesterday and tomorrow is not a firm wall, but a door ajar, where the impossible only waits a moment to reveal itself. And that moment often arrives first in the form of cold. There was something deeply unsettling about knowing that just when science seemed to have reached a point where we could predict and understand almost everything about death, a case arose that reminded us how little we know, how fragile our certainties are. I couldn't stop thinking about that man dressed in black, about how his presence had felt like a shadow displacing the threads of destiny, a presence that didn't fit into the usual framework of our lives, not even within the limits we thought we knew. Who was he? What was he really looking for? I was increasingly sure that he wasn't an ordinary person, but someone with knowledge or technology beyond my understanding, who had left that mark on the body and the environment with a precise, though hidden, intention. I tried to track his image more thoroughly, following the traces on the neighborhood security cameras. But as if he had the ability to vanish from tangible reality, his movement seemed fragmented, brushstrokes that disappeared and reappeared in disconnected areas. The neighbors didn't recognize him, and the few people willing to talk about that night described him as a ghost, a form moving quickly and coldly, without making noise or leaving traces. This strengthened my conviction that I was facing something more than a simple distracted witness or a fleeting suspect. It was as if that man or that entity was part of a larger experiment, perhaps even an operator of an invisible mechanism that intervened not only at the scene of the body, but in the very structured time that defines life and death. One of the moments that marked me most during the investigation happened when one night, almost by accident, I decided to stay in the morgue much later than usual. That calm, heavy with silences, felt different, charged with a palpable tension that didn't dissipate with the darkness. While reviewing thermal recordings in search of new details, a sudden oscillation on the screen caught my attention. The pulsating light we had seen days before reappeared, but this time more intense and prolonged. Focusing on it and analyzing the spectrum, I discovered that the signal emitted infrared frequencies that didn't correspond to any known source in the area. I got up and went outside with the portable equipment, scanning the air. The temperature at that point dropped sharply, and something in the environment felt different, as if the cold was not just the absence of heat, but a presence in itself. I took a deep breath, and for a moment, that sensation of emptiness mixed with strange familiarity, as if I were at the exact edge of a threshold. That discovery reinforced my intuition. Not only was there scientific manipulation at play, but also something with a kind of intention, as if that cold had been summoned to freeze not only the cells but the very rules of existence. This led me to review fragmented documents and confidential reports that, although they didn't mention names or specific cases, spoke in veiled terms about a project seeking to tame molecular ice to contain irreversible biological processes, with applications ranging from cutting-edge medical treatments to military uses. I was amazed to think that somewhere, far from the public eye, a silent game was possibly being played in which normal lives could be moving pieces between radical advances and unimaginable risks. Just as I was immersed in these theories, I received an unexpected call from a colleague who works at a research center in Santiago, someone I trusted completely. She told me they had detected similar electromagnetic signals in other parts of the country, places where, coincidentally, deaths or disappearances linked to frozen bodily alterations had occurred. What she told me was as surreal as it was terrifying. It seemed that this was not an isolated phenomenon in Valparaiso, but the visible symptom of a large-scale experiment, a trial to understand and perhaps control shifting states between life and death at will. As I processed this information, I couldn't help but feel how the plot thickened around those bodies frozen in unnatural stillness, as if they were signals, cryptographic messages left by forces beyond our logic. I began reviewing the thermal images again to detect hidden patterns, searching for a silent language that would explain the reason behind that thermal leak that seemed to draw invisible lines between moments. There I found a detail I hadn't noticed before. The body showed a series of microthermal variations synchronized with the pulsating frequency we had detected in the light. It was like frozen breathing, a mathematical heartbeat that challenged the laws we thought immutable. At that moment, something inside me broke and awakened at the same time. I realized we were not just facing a forensic case, but something that could forever change our way of understanding death. But I also felt that terrible weight of responsibility and fear, because unveiling those secrets could not only disturb science, but profoundly alter the cultural perception of existence. I found myself wondering, what if this cold that arrived first is necessary to stop a greater process, to protect us from something worse, or even prepare the world for a paradigmatic change? Or is it simply a warning, an invisible sign etched in frozen bodies? The following days turned into a succession of calls and exchanges of information with experts in cryobiology, quantum physics, and neurology. Some specialists showed genuine interest, others stubborn skepticism, and a few seemed disturbingly nervous, almost as if they were touching a boundary they preferred not to approach. In conversations that lasted until late hours, the same unspoken question always arose. What if a few people with access to that technology were capable of playing with the body's vital time, making it stop and perhaps start again? What implications would that have for ethics, for the very nature of what it means to be alive? Amid that whirlwind of experiences and data, I received one last piece of the puzzle that left me perplexed. A confidential laboratory report, leaked by an anonymous source, described a failed trial under real conditions. It spoke of subjects entering a state known as deep-induced hibernation, where brain metabolism slows to levels near total paralysis, but after hours on the edge, some vital functions could be reactivated with specific stimuli. The document detailed that those early experiments had been halted due to unforeseen consequences and the inability to control neurological side effects, but that recently, in a much more secret context, they had resumed under far more sophisticated protocols. I had the feeling that file, that frozen body, and the pulsating light were direct parts of that effort to master the uncontrollable. Despite fear and uncertainty, a spark of fascination drove me to keep searching for answers. I knew I could be crossing an irrecoverable boundary at any moment, opening a door of no return, but also that there, right at that limit, lay the true mystery. It wasn't just a scientific or police matter, but a philosophical crossroads that challenged the very essence of what it means to end and what might come after. Meanwhile, that corpse remained in the morgue, unchanging, surrounded by a cold that seemed to have solidified into something more than a physical phenomenon. In the darkness, that body had become for me a symbol, the silent testimony of an invisible battle, the crack through which doubt about our certainty before death filters. I couldn't share that thought openly, but I carried it with me as an indelible mark, a sign that sometimes the inexplicable not only exists, but watches us from stillness and ice. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would look again at that sequence of thermal images in the frost-covered body, wondering what would have happened if, somehow, I had managed to understand, or even stop, that strange dance between time and cold. I asked myself who the man in black was, what role he had played, and where he had disappeared to. That character seemed more like a specter than a person, a figure crossing veils invisible to others, whose steps had left scars as deep as the cold that spread that night in Valparaiso. Deep down, I understood there was no definitive conclusion, only open doors inviting clearer and braver eyes. That death, which we believe in absolute limit, might be only the first layer of a much greater enigma, where the cold was not the enemy but an ally, a silent guardian of the threshold between what was and what still could be. And maybe, if we are able to pay attention, that cold that arrived first will be pointing us toward a new frontier, one where life and death converge in a silent whisper, perceptible only to those who dare to listen. Because in the end, in that icy instant when everything seemed to stop, I realized there is no greater truth than uncertainty's ability to open us to unexpected horizons, and that on that invisible edge, the cold does not only freeze bodies, but also awakens the spirit, reminding us that the impossible sometimes only waits for the right moment to become reality. And that moment, more often than we want to admit, begins in the frozen stillness and the deep darkness of a night that, without warning, arrived long before we did. That night, while the cold continued to envelop more like an almost tangible presence, I found myself submerged in a sea of thoughts that blended with the mist slipping to the old windows of the place. The feeling was like walking in a territory that not only challenged my training or knowledge, but the very logic that underpinned my understanding of the world. I began to notice small changes, subtleties I hadn't seen before, an imperceptible vibration in the air, a slight tremor that seemed to emanate from the body itself, as if it weren't just there still, but try to communicate or resist something greater. An urgent need to understand awakened in me, to go beyond protocols and routine. I knew that if I continued down that path, I would clash with uncomfortable truths, with deeper layers of mystery that could risk not only my professional reputation, but even my own sense of reality. Yet, The weight of curiosity, mixed with that strange respect for the unknown, outweighed any fear. I began recording data with state-of-the-art devices that, until then, I had only used occasionally. Fluctuating temperatures, electromagnetic fields out of range, minimal electrical pulses that seemed synchronized with an absolutely unconventional frequency. All of that made me increasingly aware that this coal was something alive, although not in the usual sense. I decided I had to return to the scene of the discovery, one of those forgotten corners of Valparaiso, where the streets tangle and sounds seem to dissolve among ancient walls. With basic thermal and electromagnetic measuring equipment, I advanced toward that point with a mix of anxiety and anticipation that few of my previous cases had ever provoked. The air was dense, saturated with cold moisture that, rather than helping dissipate body heat, seemed to slowly extract it, as if something in the environment was absorbing it with a hidden intent. As I examined every corner, every shadow, something caught my attention. An almost imperceptible inscription etched into the stone of a nearby wall that I had not noticed until then. It was a series of abstract symbols that could have been dismissed as mere mundane handwriting, but when viewed under ultraviolet light, they revealed strokes and patterns that seemed designed to influence the thermal environment of the place. I can't exactly explain how, but intuition told me this was no coincidence. It was a sign, a message encrypted in code. That night, back at the morgue, the line between science and superstition began to blur for me. I could no longer think of that phenomenon solely from a cold, clinical standpoint. There was a story behind it, a narrative that could not fit within the usual margins of my forensic studies. It was a puzzle woven with invisible threads, some crossing boundaries I didn't even know could exist. I began researching local myths related to ice and death, legends speaking of those who master eternal ice, hidden figures supposedly capable of stopping time in flesh and souls. I dismissed most as mere folklore, but I couldn't help but feel certain coincidences give me goosebumps. What if there was a vestige of truth in those stories? A shadow of what was actually happening? At that moment, the frequency of the pulsing light I had detected earlier resumed its unsettling play. Reviewing the thermal recordings, I found that its pulses not only altered the ambient temperature, but seemed to interact directly with the body tissues, modulating a pattern of unnatural biological decomposition and balance. Something was intervening in the decay process to delay it, or maybe suspend it. This idea of suspension became an obsession. What were the chances that this cold not only preserved but controlled life itself in a temporal pause? I felt amazed and disturbed at the same time. It seemed that somehow, death had ceased to be an irreversible limit and had turned into a manipulable state. One morning, while trying to publish part of my findings on a specialist forum, I noticed access to certain studies and documents I had worked with began mysteriously closing. Some of my sources became inaccessible, and communication with related colleagues grew erratic, even distrustful. That was when I realized that, unknowingly, I had ventured into a monitored territory where the lines between open science and state secrets were blurry and dangerous. The word confidentiality took on a greater meaning for me, something far deeper than a mere protocol, a veil laid to prevent certain truths from coming to light. Nevertheless, the need to understand was stronger. I received an anonymous email with an attachment containing thermal images and extremely detailed data from another case in Patagonia, in an underground lab that, according to speculation, had been shut down years ago due to unethical activities. The data showed a similar phenomenon: bodies in hypometabolic states, body areas with concentrated cold, electrical pulses synchronized with specific seasons of the year. But the most disturbing were the notes in the margins, references to a temporal containment protocol, a project that, if real, had experimented with time as a malleable substance, capable of being compressed and extended at will. It was a turning point. I began connecting all the pieces and considering the increasingly firm possibility that we were facing a technological advance capable of changing humanity's fundamental perception of life's finitude. The idea of playing with the margin of vital time had ethical, philosophical, and social implications of terrifying magnitude. Yet, I also felt that if we could understand it, perhaps we could find a way to use that science for good, maybe to save lives, to stop suffering. But it was clear that, at least for now, that frontier remained a dangerous, unexplored, and closely watched territory. Weeks passed, and that painful trance turned into routine, or at least I tried to disguise it. However, my mind never stopped circling around those frozen bodies, that light pulsing from nothingness, and that elusive figure, the man dressed in black, whose traces seemed to race not only from time but space itself. I began having strange dreams, where the cold was not just the absence of heat, but an entity whispering through my skin, speaking a language made of silence and broken crystals. In those dreams, I saw fragments of places, faces reflecting both despair and hope simultaneously, as if the cold preserved not only bodies but also memories, secrets, and entire destinies. One night, while reviewing the documentation one last time before closing the case with my superiors, I received a text message with coordinates. There was no sender, just the numbers, pointing to a coastal area, a so-called neutral site rumored for years to be a clandestine meeting point for unofficial experiments. I decided to go, driven by a mix of fear and determination. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different. The air vibrated with intense cold and an absolute stillness that seemed to suspend time itself. There, among the rocks in silence, I found a small device buried in the earth, an artifact covered in ice that vibrated with the same frequency as that strange luminous pulse. Quick shots, preliminary analyses, and in an instant I understood that this, beyond its physical shape, was a key to a greater mechanism, a kind of generator that expanded and maintained frozen that temporal distortion in human bodies. At that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The morgue, the light, the man in black, all the pieces fit into a puzzle revealing the existence of an invisible network, a secret plot, a hidden objective beneath the surface of everyday life. I felt fear, but also a deep responsibility. What I had discovered posed a choice no one should take lightly. Should we protect that secret, hide it at all costs to prevent chaos and abuse? Or was it knowledge that deserved to be shared so humanity could prepare for a new chapter, uncertain yet fascinating, in the history of existence? The following days consumed me in intense reflection. I understood that this cold, so relentless and absolute, which had first arrived at that body in the morgue and spread over the city, was actually a messenger, not an enemy, but a veiled warning that time had ceased to be an immovable boundary and had become a malleable space, a terrain where life and death dance an uncertain dance. That's why, in the end, I realized the mystery did not lie in the cold itself, but in what that cold revealed about us, about our limits and possibilities. Sometimes, when night falls and silence floods the city, I mentally return to that moment, to that exact feeling of standing on the edge of the threshold, sensing the tense matter of frozen time. I tell myself that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold that came first was a prologue, a prelude to a future where the certainties that have defined us until now dissolve with the ice, and where true power is no longer understanding death, but learning to live with its shadow, its pause, and its suspended breath. And in that conviction, no matter how absurd it seems, I find a kind of unsettling hope, a call to keep exploring, not to fear the cold because maybe in its frozen silence lies the key to open doors we didn't even know existed. I returned to the makeshift laboratory in my mind over and over again, recalling every detail with the precision of a surgeon. What I had in my hands defied any trivial explanation. The frozen device, an unexpected blend of ancient engineering and advanced technology, seemed designed to maintain that intangible cold, that pause in the timeline that I had begun to observe. It was not just a physical anomaly, but a mechanism that manipulated the very essence of the passage of time. Every pulse it emitted prevented decomposition from following its natural course, as if the body were trapped in that perfect moment, suspended in a limbo between life and death. Each new analysis, every piece of data I recorded, opened more questions and answers. It was impossible not to wonder what would happen if that cold extended beyond a single body. It could affect a group, perhaps an entire city, or worse, a whole civilization. Would it then be possible to stop the clock of humanity? However, the price seemed incredibly high, not only because of the obvious attraction to immortality or life extension, but because the very fabric of our reality seemed to tear under this influence. What once seemed so solid and reliable, like the inexorable advance of time, suddenly became unstable and unpredictable ground. In the days that followed, I realized I was no longer alone in this quest. Anonymous voices, cryptic messages, shadows watching me from the corners of my research, The constant feeling of being observed all indicated that my discovery not only broke scientific conventions, but had also ventured into territories where politics, power, and greed intertwined with science. I found out that more than one secret organization had experimented with that mysterious cold, attempting to control its reach for uses far beyond medicine or forensic anthropology. Weapons, mind manipulation techniques, and tools to halt natural processes hidden behind a veil of silence and secrets that no one wanted to bring to light. That man in black, whose presence I had recorded time and again in my memories and dreams, took shape for me during that stage. He was not a specter nor a myth. He was too real. His silent march, his piercing eyes, and above all, a precise intervention at every key point of the phenomenon suggested he was someone meant to oversee, or perhaps protect, that which should not be discovered by mere mortals. I thought of speaking to him, of confronting the unknown, but doubt paralyzed me. Would I be speaking to a guardian or a jailer? Would he be a bridge to the truth, or someone tasked with burying that knowledge forever? One night, while studying comparative thermal patterns, I received a message that seemed to come from another time. It was neither an email nor a common text, but coded transmission that slipped into my laboratory secure network. The signal contained a star map, precisely aligned with series of dates and geographic coordinates, some of which I recognized from my research, but others were a complete enigma. What struck me was the implication. There was a hidden calendar, a kind of universal clock linked to that cold phenomenon, which not only affected Earth, but had a reflection in cosmological cycles, planetary alignments, and events that could mark phases of activation or rest of the device, and perhaps of the very life it had frozen. This discovery led me back to the coast, to the edge of cliffs overlooking the turbulent ocean, a force violently contrasted with that glacial stillness I had pursued since the beginning. I felt that the cold, though present, held a kind of balance, as if it were a heartbeat beneath the surface of the natural world, a secret between nature and human technology, between life and death. That balance was fragile, but if broken, the consequence could be cataclysmic. The idea of temporal manipulation was not just an advancement, but a latent threat, a power that could grant absolute control or sow irreparable chaos. Weeks passed in which I worked alone, with my circle of trust shrinking more and more. With each analysis, I delved deeper into the chemical nature of the affected tissues, trying to find patterns of stability and decay. My sensors detected fluctuations that coincided with ancient myths and stories from indigenous peoples of southern Chile, who spoke of beings that mastered ice not only as an element, but as a vital force capable of repairing or destroying, of stopping pain or freezing hope. The line between science and myth blurred within the spectrum of possibilities, and I, a man trained in the strictest objectivity, began to consider concepts I had previously discarded. One night, when the wind was howling fiercely through the city, while reviewing the last images I had managed to record, I witnessed something that chilled my blood more than any physical temperature. In a thermal sequence, the frozen human form showed a faint luminous pulse, a flash of energy that seemed to briefly awaken beneath millimeter-thick layers of ice. It was not a technical reflection nor an error. That figure, which seemed dead, was breathing in a way science could not explain. It was as if, in that icy silence, time itself was flickering, attempting to resume, try to free itself from an invisible prison that I was only beginning to understand. I then recalled everything I had read about hypometabolic states induced in animals to survive extreme conditions. But this was different, because here consciousness and identity seemed to remain intact, even if a suspended state, trapped between oblivion and memory. And that idea struck me strongly. If the knowledge of cold could keep those fragments of existence alive, what did it imply then for our deepest concepts of soul, time, and destiny? Could science advance to the point of containing the vital flow in a crystal of eternity? Or were we simply facing a dangerous illusion, a boundary we should not cross? My thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar but different, charged with urgency and warning. They told me my research had been detected by groups who would not seek dialogue or ethics, but control and power. That confirmed I could not take another step without extreme precautions. But it also awakened in me an unyielding determination. What I had discovered must be known to the world, at least in part. I could not let fear or darkness forbid access to a future that, Although uncertain and dangerous, might contain in its frozen silences a truth necessary for all humanity. After ending that call, I looked again at the coordinates I had received weeks before, reflecting on how cold, that silent visitor who came first, was actually a beacon, a signal to break our own limits and understand that time, like life, is much more complex than we ever imagined. I learned that behind that icy veil hides a paradox, a mystery that does not promise definitive answers, but a constant call to exploration, to fear neither the void nor the halt, because within them may reside the key to understanding, perhaps, true eternity. And so, while the Chilean winter continued covering the forgotten corners with its icy mantle, I knew the journey had only just begun, because the cold that came first not only stopped death, but opened a door to the unknown, teaching me that nothing, not even time, can be taken as an unbreakable limit. What seemed like an icy end was actually a beginning, a silent invitation to learn to live with the deepest shadow of existence, the one hidden in the frozen silence where time and life meet to dance together in an eternal pause.